Hello, BookTube. I missed last week's Sunday New York Times because I was in a tiny town in Vermont where they had no place to get such a Sunday New York Times. You couldn't walk out the door and do it. You could walk out the door and maybe encounter a deer or a wild turkey, but you couldn't go and get the Sunday Times. But I'm back, and I went to the corner store and got the Sunday Times today, and I thought we'd go over the book review. That's always a lot of fun. The Times starts off this time around with a front page. The front and center of the front page is an article about Prince Mohammed bin Zayed of Abu Dhabi, of the United Arab Emirates, the richest man in the world. And it's a story by David Kirkpatrick all about his power brokering in Washington, how he's this incredibly influential person who no one's ever heard of. I thought that was fascinating, of course, since part of my monthly income comes from Abu Dhabi, and therefore, in some part or in whole, from him. But then I also read. I mean, I didn't just read the book review. I go through the whole of the New York Sunday Times, the whole thing, and I got to the op-ed section, the Sunday Review. This is often a bad idea. A lot of the things that are in the op-ed section are designed to irritate. They're designed to generate reader feedback. The most prominent thing in here was by Gregory Gibson. It's called "After My Son Was Killed in a School Shooting, I began fighting for stricter gun laws. I knew guns were the problem. Then I became a gun owner." And that is clearly designed to flood the Times with reader responses. But I was more struck by the thing right beneath it, "Grief Without God," by Amber Scora. This is an adaptation from her book "Leaving the Witness." And it starts off with, "Several years after leaving my religion, I felt sure I had encountered all the situations I might possibly need to get used to in my new life. What I had not prepared myself for was death, grief without faith, which is to say, death without hope. Religion was born for this." That is absolutely true. That last line is absolutely true. Religion was born of two primal impulses. The first being a fear of death, and the second being the mafia. If you're a person, a man of a certain type, then it's going to appeal to you greatly to be able to go to someone from whom you want something, not something spiritual, but something very tangible, and say, "I've got the ear of someone who has the ability to do you infinite harm, so maybe you should do something for me so I don't do that." In other words, it's a nice life you got here. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to it. Religion is born of those two impulses, plus the infinite imagination of human beings. And when I started this article, that line, "religion was born for this," is absolutely true, and I really liked it. But it bugged me, that bit, "death without hope," bugged me just a bit, because that has always made no sense to me. Hope of what? Hope of what? What hope does losing religion rob you of? And of course, there's only one answer: the hope that you will see alive and in their prime whoever it is that you've lost. And that's not hope. That's a crazy delusion. It's not like you lose hope when you lose religion. You lose the hope of insane, crazy things. You still have plenty of hope. You hope, of course, as I know perfectly well, and some of you know, when you're in the grip of fresh grief, when it's hot on you and you don't believe there's any light anywhere, the hope is that light will break through, that life will return to you, that the desire to be alive will return to you. I have faced that many times. I faced that 3 times just in the time I've had this channel. And it does break through, unless you're grieving wrong, unless your grieving has dug itself into an unhealthy channel and you can't dig it out again. Sometimes that does happen, and then people need help. But unless you're grieving wrong, you will recover. You hope to recover, and you do. And that is death with hope. But it turns out, in reading the article, that it's much more nuanced than that death without hope thing that irritated me at the beginning is probably just because I'm thin-skinned on the subject. The essay turned out to be just beautiful. Just absolutely beautiful. The author's loss of a baby really brings home the idea of grief and religion. I loved it. And I don't ordinarily go through the Times opinion section and end up loving something. But then we get to the treat, which is the book review. This is the summer reading issue, and you can feel in a minute that it's twice as big as usual. And that's because it's got a lot more in it. Not just in terms of the books it covers, but in terms of the type of thing about them. The summer book issue breaks down books by subject matter, genre and subject matter, and then gives the writer a much longer space, a 2-page spread to cover new releases in that area. I realize the Times can't do this all the time, but this was just a feast to just, but it starts off with their usual features. There's the mail, and they got a lot. Remember, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that they had an opinion section piece about why so many books about dogs. The author suddenly, because the author's a millennial, the author suddenly decided, hey, there are a lot of books about dogs. Why has that never happened before I went to middle school? And predictably, the letters page is full of writers writing in and saying, it did. there's this example and that example and the other example. But there's one letter that I really like. It's from Stephen Halig in San Francisco, and he writes, I just read Vanessa Woods and Brian Hare's fine essay, Why So Many Books About Dogs, to my big mutt, Shugi, who thought for a moment, shook his head gently, and replied, okay, but if they have to ask, they'll never know. I like that. And then they move on. Another regular feature is the By the Book section, where the Times asks a bunch of preset questions to various people. This feature and features like it have been decried by pretentosauruses who want to, just kidding, we just have book reviews that opine, well, this is a waste of time. But I've never found it a waste of time. I find it fascinating. And the person they picked this time around is conservative commentator George Will. And I read his answers eagerly, even though it felt a little redundant, since we do, after all, have David Murphy's BookTube channel. It felt a little redundant to read George Will's talking about books. But he has a lot of interesting things to say. Like, for instance, the very first question is, what are the books on your nightstand? And he reveals right out of the bat that he is an audiobook fan. We've had a discussion on discussions on BookTube have been endless about, do audiobooks count as real reading? Who does them? What do you do them? When do you do them? How much of your reading do they encounter? And it turns out George Will fills time with audiobooks. And they're predictably highbrow. But he also has, he says of the books scattered around, he has Kate Atkinson's transcription, which really needs rereading. I'm waiting. I'll get the paperback of that, and I need to reread it. It's a very brainy, twisty novel. And also David Blight's Frederick Douglass and Victor Sebastian's Lenin biography. 2 top-notch biographies. And Elaine Weiss's The Woman's Hour, which was great, about women achieving the right to vote in the United States. And also Sean Millent's No Property in Man, about slavery. So in addition to all the audiobooks, he also has that. And then the next question is, tell us about the last great book you read, and he nominates The British Are Coming by Rick Atkinson, the first book in his Revolution trilogy, the author of the Liberation trilogy about U.S. armed services during World War II. And I thought The British Are Coming was fantastic, just fantastic. So that was great. then David Murphy, George Will is asked, what's the best political philosophy book or theory? The best book on political philosophy or theory? And George Will says, Aristotle's Politics, followed closely, very closely, by The Federalist, a collection of newspaper columns, and then he can't resist adding, a genre that reached its apogee in 1788. Yeah, thanks, George. Thanks very much. I think you're probably a century and a half off, but that you wouldn't be George Will if you weren't a cranky old man. He's been a cranky old man for 70 years. Then he's asked, which books do you think capture the current social and political moment? He recommends Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men, and so do I. And a bunch of other things too. Timothy Carney's Alienated America and Yuval Lenin's The Fractured Republic. I read both of those as part. I'm not missing any of the flood of, oh my God, it's all over, oh my God, it's end times books. We're getting a flood of those, at least 30 every season. And I'm making a point to read them all. That's our moment in the book world. And I read both of those and thought they were above average. So he's asked, what book should everybody read before the age of 21? He recommends The Great Gatsby and says that you should read it in order to be cautioned on the perils of life lived as a series of gestures. A clear George Willian swipe at Instagram and Twitter. Then what book might people be surprised to find on your shelves? You're not going to be surprised by the answer at all. It's Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' selected works in 2 volumes. That doesn't surprise me in the least. Then they ask a question. You're organizing a dinner party, a literary dinner party, and you can have 3 writers, dead or alive. Who do you pick? And he picks Albert Camus. He says that The Stranger was his introduction to serious reading. He picks Thomas Mann, and he does it for The Magic Mountain. And then, to my infinite pleasure, he says that because Albert Camus and Thomas Mann probably would make for a somber evening, he needs somebody to lighten things up. And I was amazed at the person he picks. To lighten the evening, Peter de Vries, the only American novelist wittier than Mark Twain. Like Margaret Mead among the Samoans, de Vries was an anthropologist observing middle-class Americans from 1950s to the 1980s. God, if George Will still held the kind of authority that he once held in the literary and intellectual landscape of America, there would be a rush of Peter de Vries reprints tomorrow. And I would love that. But as it is, I don't think Peter de Vries is in print at all. Anyway, Will is asked what to name an overrated book. He names Catcher in the Rye and says that Holden Caulfield should have been strangled in the cradle. Just what the world does not need, another sullen adolescent. And he's asked what book he's going to read next, and he names Metropolis by Philip Kerr, the next and the last Bernie Gunther story since Philip Kerr died. And this book was at the publisher when he died, so this is it for Bernie Gunther. And he says that when Kerr died last year, so did Bernie. Both will be missed. So there you go. That was a nice visit with George Will. He doesn't have a BookTube channel, but then we get into the reviews, and this is an amazing book review, something I probably want to keep and Toto just stick it in a box somewhere, because it not only has individual reviews of books, but it has these thematic 2-page spreads as well. So you get the normal book review. Those individual pages of reviews would be the normal book review in the course of things, with maybe 1 2-page spread or 1 roundup. But instead, it's review after review after review. You have Alan Cumming reviewing the new that John Waters book, Mr. Know-It-All. You have Sarah Perry, the author of The Essex Serpent, reviewing The Poisoned Bed by Elizabeth Fremantle, her Jacobite murder mystery / historical opera. It didn't quite work on me, and it doesn't quite work on Sarah Perry, although she does like it for its strengths, and so did I. But then we move on to thrillers. Vanessa, look at that picture. Vanessa Friedman does a bunch of thrillers, and one of the ones she does is Cari Mora, the new novel by Thomas Harris. And she has a good paragraph. No character is guilt-free, and they reek of a moral ambiguity that is mirrored in the sense of place Harris creates. That makes them more interesting, except for the villain, who she rightly cites as cartoonish. Especially Cari Mora herself, whose special skills and ability to ignore introspection derive from her own painful history. And that's a great way to put it, because Cari Mora doesn't really agonize. She doesn't really do that in the course of the book. I hadn't thought to put it that way, but ignore introspection is good. And then there are a bunch of other thrillers: Beyond All Reasonable Doubt, Nearly Normal Family, Into the Jungle, The Paper Wasp, and Temper, none of which I've read. And so it was fascinating to read these things, because I will determine sometimes some of what I want to read based on this. Then David Itzikoff reviews the new big biography of Mel Brooks. He likes it, but in a limited way, and I liked it even less. I wanted to like it. It's called Funny Man, and it didn't do it for me. I have a lot of very, very negative opinions, very, very negative encounters with Mel Brooks. So maybe that colored it. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. And then, mystifyingly, Molly Young reviews How to Become a Federal Criminal, a little book that was spawned from a series of tweets. It doesn't deserve a full-page review. It has 2, not 1, but 2 big illustrations to try to eat up space. And the author even knows that. She even knows that at one point in the review, she says, I should offer a disclaimer here. I normally approach Twitter-spawned book deals the way I approach novelizations of movies, which is to say, not at all, thanks. And then she makes a lame justification how the elaborations in this case improve the book. They don't. It's a triviality. She just wanted to write about the book because it's fun to write about. Things you can do in America that do constitute federal crimes. But that's all. I couldn't help but think of it as a page wasted. Then we have travel books. And look at the illustration. If I remember, I'll leave a link to a YouTube video, an astonishing YouTube video in which a bunch of people in Africa, relaxing at their hotel's outdoor pool, are surprised by a massive male bull elephant who comes up to the pool specifically to do that, to drink the water. There's a video, there's probably more than one, but there's one video that's just astonishing. It's just a thought. If this thing had reached into the pool and grabbed one of these people, they would be dead. But the travel books are Seven at Sea, The Salt Path, In Putin's Footsteps by the granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, a book that I thought had a lot of worth to it, a lot more worth than I thought. Lotharingia, which we saw on this channel, I bought a temporary country in Europe that... It just didn't... I mean, it was very well done. It just didn't interest me at all. Then Ottoman Odyssey by Alev Scott, which we saw on this channel and which I really liked. Volcanoes, Palm Trees, and Privileged, which is a series of essays on Hawaii by Overcup Press in paperback. And this is a little indication, a little gauge of what the New York Times book room must be like. They must get copies of literally everything. Oh, I have access now. I'm very happy, very privileged to have access to a newspaper book room. And it's a lot of books, and I deal with them, and I see what they are, but I would never get a paperback release from Overcup Books. Never. In a million years. And then you go one rung up. I also have had access to the Boston Globe's book room back 35 years ago, when it was a slightly more ambitious and more serious paper had for instance, bureaus elsewhere, and got every book under the sun, and that book room was bigger. And I have seen pictures and little video clippets of the Washington Post book room, and I have a feeling I can guess how big the Wall Street Journal's book room is. And the New York Times is the biggest of them all. They must get everything. Then Pagan Light, that book about Capri that we saw. See You in the Piazza by Frances Mays, which I did not like at all. I wanted to, but I just didn't like it at all. Then Off the Rails, and two books about France, Mission Mediocre and A Year in Paris. And that was the travel spread. Then we get a few more individual reviews, including someone named J.D. Beersdorfer reviews Mallory O'Meara's book, The Lady from the Black Lagoon, about Millicent Patrick, who designed The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And they give the book a full page review, which was very pleasing to me. It's a little bit late. The book's almost in paperback by now, but I reviewed it as well and really liked it. And the reviewer, J.D. Beersdorfer, notices a couple of the things about the book that I didn't like, and they bothered this reviewer as well. So that's those two things, those two notes, if they're sounded often enough in other book reviews, ought to be a note to Mallory O'Meara to, that this is what you this was a legitimate misstep in your execution of the book. No doubt about it. If many different critics in many different venues all stumble on the same thing without consulting each other, then that thing is probably a stumbling block. And then we get to True Crime. The chalk outline of the dead body is floating on the surface of the pool. And quite a few of these things are about Jack the Ripper. There are a couple of them are about Jack the Ripper. All about true crime stories. Just fantastic. Then a couple more individual reviews. We get Matthew Schneier reviews Boom, about the contemporary art market. Fascinating book. And we also get Charles Finch, who we've seen before. He did The Vanishing Man, which is a murder mystery that I talked about on this channel. He writes a series of murder mysteries that are really good. And here he reviews Hot, Cold, Heavy, Light, collected art writings by Peter Schejdal, in which his opening paragraph, I don't quite know what to make of it. Or rather, I think I do. Whatever chips a critic might accumulate in honor, for honesty or temperance, for reading backlists, for punctuality, or for nodding politely when yet another person recommends all the light we cannot see, for whatever, I would like to push them all of mine to the center of the table on behalf of the following statement. This author is a great artist. I don't know what that crack about all the light we cannot see is meant to be. I think maybe I do. It's become the book to snootily sneer upon. I thought it was wonderful. And I stick by that. But then we get a 2-page spread by Adam Gopnik. If you get Adam Gopnik willing to write 2,000 words, then you let him write 2,000 words. And this is on that new Dr. Seuss biography, which I quite liked. I didn't think I would. I think I'm the only person who knows enough who has read the biographical facts of Dr. Seuss's life and finds in them an odious person. Most people that I've read, biographical sketches of the guy don't seem to see that in his writing. So then we get sports. The bookworm is playing with a paddleboard, just briefly, I'm sure. And of course, I haven't read any of the sports books. Then we move on to YA. That we get 5 YA books. I've only read one of them, and the one I read was Birthday by Meredith Russo. And the writer here is Jen Dahl, whose a young adult novel is Unclaimed Baggage. And at one point, Jen Dahl writes, one of the great wonders of YA fiction is its power to create new narratives that replace fear and hatred with empathy and acceptance, and to show young people a path for the future that's better than what they've seen. And I don't agree with that. That's not one of the, what does she call it? One of the great wonders of YA fiction. That's one of the great weaknesses of 21st century YA fiction, is that it's endlessly affirmative. It's endlessly sunny, so that the characters never earn anything, so that they're constantly reaffirming each other and receiving affirmation from every single corner, except for the small and tedious papier-mâché obstacle that they face and then easily overcome. I would argue that the best YA does the opposite of that, but I've only read the one of the books on this list, so I will if I like Jen Dahl's write-up of Birthday, which didn't impress me, if I like the tone of her write-up of these other things, then maybe I'll use it as a recommendation to get these other things. And then there's a page on romance. There's a page on romance by Jamie Green, who is the Book Review's romance columnist. And I was intrigued by the variety of the books that are picked here. First one is a thing that I mistook for YA. I think it is YA, whether it's flying under those colors or not. It's a book, a debut by Casey McQuiston called Red, White, and Royal Blue, about an American boy and a British royal who fall in love. And I thought it was well done. I wonder, I'm trying to remember now if... McQuiston masterfully navigates 2 very different political realms, conjuring the quick-fire decision-making of the progressive White House and the iron-grip traditionalism of Buckingham Palace with equal skill. That would be impressive enough, but it's nothing compared to the consuming vividness of the 2 main characters. They shine as individuals, and when they fall in love, the intensity of their infatuation, youthful but not immature, is intoxicating. But in addition to that, the author also picks A Prince on Paper by Alyssa Cole, a romance novel that I loved. I thought it was fantastic. And the author likes it too, except that she thinks that the main character, Naya, is a little too perfect. And reading that in the review, I can sort of look back on the book and say, all right, well, it didn't bother me at the time that I read it, but I think there's definitely a case. You could definitely make that case. She writes that... the flawed hero/redeeming heroine is a common dynamic in historical romance, which Cole's contemporary series, with its focus on royalty, is obviously in conversation with. While Johann, though not a scoundrel, gets to make mistakes, stumble, and almost fall, Naya is almost too good. With so much of the real world infused into the setting, her near perfection jangles. She grew up overly protected and friendless, yet she's perceptive of the thoughts, feelings, and motivations of everyone around her. I kind of see that. That's kind of a good knock. I wouldn't have done it myself. The next one we have is music. James Parker he writes for The Atlantic, and he does a whole bunch of music books, none of which I know anything about. Then we move on to individual reviews. And there was one here. Elaine Showalter reviews The Drama of Celebrity. I don't think we even saw that book on this channel, and I have not read it. And then Science Fiction and Fantasy gets a whole page. And one of the books on there is Ted Chiang's Exhalation, which is called Brilliant from start to finish, and which I really liked. I don't think I'd call it brilliant from start to finish. Then this inset is international fiction. Just a 2-page spread of fiction from all different parts of the world. Fascinating. And again, only the kind of thing that you could do if you had access to the Times near limitless book room. What I wouldn't give to see it. What I wouldn't give to know what the procedure is. for how they deal with it. Do interns regularly patrol it? Those interns have lists of people, of particular editors or writers who get particular kinds of books? And do those writers and editors ever wonder if the interns are making mistakes or simply missing things? Don't need to worry about it at the Christian Science Monitor anymore. Then we get a few more individual reviews. Then the next page spread is by Danielle Trussoni, and it is the horror spread. The picture would delight the black and twisted heart of Cameron, the movie guy. Look at that. And it's a bunch of horror novels, none of which I've heard about. Although I have to object to the other picture insert on the next page. There's a picture insert of two of the survivors of the Donner Party. It's extremely bad taste. They aren't figures of horror. But it jarred me, that's all. Then there's a page for graphic novels, one of which is about that book on Zippy the Pinhead that I got a lot of... I never read it. I've never been a fan of the artist or his work, but a lot of people that I know, a lot of people whose judgments on books I respect, really like that book. Here, let me give you the exact attribution. It's Nobody's Fool: The Life and Times of Schlitzie the Pinhead, which is about Bill Griffith's creation. His signature. This is by Bill Griffiths. I don't know. It was an elaborate hardcover, so I don't know if it'll get a paperback. But it's one of those books that's nagged at me all this time. It's one of those books that I wish I could go back. We don't have it. I don't have a copy anymore. Monitor doesn't have a copy anymore, and I wish I could go back and look at it, because it's one of those books that just never in big highlights, but always down below, people talking about it in a way that makes me wish I had not ignored it. Then we have historical fiction, and it's just a huge array of the deluge of historical fiction that we're getting in 2019, including Mistress of the Ritz, which I just recently reviewed. The person here is Susan Ellingwood. She's a former books and opinion writer at the Times, and she reviews Mistress of the Ritz and really likes it. She also reviews Paris 7 a.m., the Elizabeth Bishop novel, and does not like it. Considers it a jumble, a mess, and says that maybe the best thing about it is that maybe it will send people back to Elizabeth Bishop's own work, which is the kind of thing, if you worked really hard on a historical novel, you don't want to read that as a verdict. Then maybe some good will come of this book by making you read someone else. Then we go back to more individual stuff, including David Friend, he's an editor at Vanity Fair, and he reviews Best Movie Year Ever. That book that says that 1999 was the greatest year in cinematic history. And at the end of his review is very thoughtful, very good, very wise about movies. And he ends on a note that I couldn't help but appreciate. He says, Rafferty's right. 1999 did rewire how we tell stories in moving pictures. Morpheus, we're not in Kansas anymore, quote from The Matrix, one of those movies from that year. Then again, best movie year ever may also be biased, inflating the significance of the cultural touchstones of its author's youth. In that regard, I'd like to speak up for 1968, which turned out 2001: A Space Odyssey, Rosemary's Baby, Yellow Submarine, The Producers, Bullet, Night of the Living Dead, and The Lion in Winter. In addition to, I believe, one that he doesn't name there is The Birdman of Alcatraz. But either way, 1968 is an excellent candidate. Maybe Brian Rafferty, the author of Best Movie Year Ever, could do another one on 1968. That would be great. Then we get to cooking. Of course, I don't know anything about the cooking books, but it's a 2-page spread. How wonderful is that? This book review just goes on forever and ever. I wish they could do this every year or every week, but of course they can't. And then we go back to, let's see, more individual reviews. Someone named Dan Marshall does a 2-review piece on memoirs. And one of the memoirs that he does is How to Forget by Kate Mulgrew. And I was very pleased to see that he praises it to the roof, which is fantastic. That is... it's a beautiful portrait of a daughter's love for her parents, packed with sharp, amusing recollections, all told with love. And he goes through a lot of the details of it. I couldn't agree more. The book just impressed the daylights out of me. Then couple more. There's two reviews on one page, both of which are historical fiction. I guess they were too meaty to be in the roundup of historical fiction. And then books about the great outdoors, which include it's many books about nature and trees and animals and whatnot, but it includes Wings in the Light from Yale University Press about butterflies, which I really liked, really impressed me. And the author, Dominique Browning, who's formerly the editor of House and Garden, it impressed Dominique Browning as well. That's nice to know. More individual book reviews, much more individual book reviews. Miranda Seymour, who wrote In Byron's Wake, reviews the Regency years, that book that we saw by Robert Morrison, and largely likes it. Largely likes it. It's a small review. David Enrick reviews Bitcoin Billionaires by Ben Mesrick about the Winklevoss twins. Mesrick takes a favorable view of these creatures, mainly because he relied on them almost entirely for source material for his book. And lots of other people have too. Even David Enrick, who is a finance editor for the Times, doesn't seem to go after the Winklevoss twins much in his review, when they are obviously amoral grifters. And yet they're not served on brochette in this review. Instead, what's served on brochette is Ben Mesrick himself. Throughout, the narrative is polluted by cliches. It might be, let's see here. And then there is Mesrick's jarring disclosure at the outset that some of the details and settings described in the book are, quote, imagined. It is hard to overcome the impression that large swaths of the book fall into that fictional zone. That includes a bizarre final scene inside Mark Zuckerberg's office. And although Enrick doesn't allude to it, if you know anything about Ben Mesrick's slightly troubled authorial career, you will remember that plagiarism and fabrication have played a large part in that career, and that maybe there's a reason why he's now labeling, warning readers ahead of time not to fact check his books. I don't know. One way or another, it's worth a story on its own. Sooner or later, somebody, maybe in 40 years, will write a book about Ben Mesrick, a Ben Mesrick style book about him. That'd be fascinating. I wouldn't want to do it. And then some more individual reviews, including Benoit Denizet-Lewis, who's an associate professor at Emerson College and a longtime writer for New York Times Magazine, reviews Walt Odet's Out of the Shadows, which we saw on this channel, and which is, his review is really good. It's really thoughtful about that book. Really nice to see it in a full-page spread like this. He mentions at one point the exquisitely told story of Odet's longtime friend and lover, who fled a trailer he shared with a brutally homophobic family and built a life bursting with meaning and intimacy, is the most compelling story of gay self-actualization I have ever encountered. Here, in his writing is poignant and achingly beautiful, so much so, in fact, that I occasionally had to put the book down to avoid weeping on the subway. I'm not much of a weeper. Or rather, I am, but not for books, for real things. But even so, I felt the same way. You moved right to the heart of things. Especially when you're reading the book and thinking that this battle is a long way from being won. It's a long way from over. You're reading these pages, and maybe you yourself are comfortable. Maybe you yourself are living the life that you want. Just out and about in the world without ever really encountering any problems. And you think, well, 200 miles away in almost any direction is someone for whom this very thing is an open battle and a losing battle. It's interesting. I recommend the book. I recommended it on this channel a couple of days ago, and I really do second that, especially now that I know the Times likes it. And then we're done. This is an extra long thing. I'm going to be poring over this thing for hours, because then we go on to the short list and the bestseller list, which is for a shameful number of people in the book industry. They get the New York Times Book Review, usually complimentary, and they go straight to the back to the bestseller list, and they don't read any of the rest of it. They just pop it on their theatrically piled desk and say, "Oh yeah, I got so much to read. Oh, I'll get to it. I'm so hampered and bedraggled But they find time for an hour or two of words with friends on their phone. And so, uh, way too many people that I know in the literary world do that. They get the book review and they go straight to the Times bestseller list and maybe the ephemera around it and ignore the rest of it. And that creates a lack of preparedness, a lack of knowledge about their own profession that is, I hate to say, sometimes visible to those of us who have that knowledge. Sometimes the lack of it is visible. So but anyway, there you go. Another hideously long video. That was the Sunday New York Times book review. I wish I could say that last Sunday, when I was at Little Farmhouse in Vermont, I was pining for the New York Times, for the Sunday New York Times and all the news that's fit to print. But I was not. I was not. I was surrounded by peace and quiet and caterwauling children and delicious food and wonderful conversation. So I did not pine for the bodega up the road. up the road from where I was were actual chickens walking in the road. so that both Frida and I went. But it's nice to be back. Even so, it's nice to. I'm gonna read. I'm gonna pour through the news sections, get down to the nitty gritty of those stories. Follow the jumps to the back sections. I'm gonna pour over this book review because there's a lot in here that I need to really read and know and appreciate. And also, the one thing that I didn't show you because it slipped out and slid onto the floor is the New York Sunday Times magazine. The glossy magazine that comes with the paper that often will have something really interesting in it. I admit, for voyeuristic reasons, sometimes the most interesting thing in the Sunday Times magazine for me are the real estate ads. the full color pictures of this apartment or that condo in Manhattan that is available for the low price of $2 million a month. Something like that, where I'd like to look at them. I would never in a million years live 30 stories above the ground or higher. I would never in a million years do that. No way. And I wouldn't want all that space. I have 2 rooms now and a few more to spare, and that to me it still seems like too much. So, but anyway, that was the New York Times. I was getting back to reading about Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. Long may he reign. But I'll be back with plenty of other bookish stuff to talk about. Not that it matters, because you haven't been paying attention to me at all in this video, just to my sleepy baby. Eyes on the prize.